Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Morgan Ellery. Today, we're returning to a case that a lot of you know, a case that still hurts when you read it again, the Watts family murders. I want to say at the top, this episode is somber. It's unsettling. We will be walking through details that are difficult to hear, and we'll be asking questions that don't have clean answers. Joining me is Dr. Lena Hart, a forensic psychologist who studies family annihilators and domestic violence dynamics. Lena, thank you for being here. Welcome to Still Unanswered.
Thank you, Morgan. I'm glad to be here. I'm also, honored that we're centering the victims in this conversation rather than sensationalizing the offender.
Right. That matters to me, and I want to make that explicit. Our focus is Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and the unborn baby Nico, and on the ripple of grief and unanswered questions left in the wake. But to understand the broader lessons, what we can and cannot know, we do need to talk through the timeline and the behaviors that investigators documented. I'll start with a brief, factual outline of what happened for listeners who need it.
Go ahead, Morgan.
In the early hours of August 13, 2018, in Frederick, Colorado, Christopher Lee Watts killed his pregnant wife, Shanann, who was 15 weeks pregnant, and their two young daughters, Bella, age 4, and Celeste, age 3. He disposed of their bodies at an Anadarko petroleum oil site where he worked. Shanann was buried in a shallow grave near tanks. Bella and Celeste were placed in separate crude oil tanks. Within days, Watts went from appearing as a grieving husband on television to confessing to the murders, pleading guilty, and receiving multiple life sentences. But, even now, motive feels to many unresolved. Lena, before we dig into what might explain this, do you want to speak briefly about why investigators and psychologists treat cases like this differently from other violent crimes?
Sure. Family annihilators, people who kill their spouse or partner and children, are a distinct profile in the literature. The dynamic often contains elements of control, perceived failure, and a desire to erase a life that the offender sees as unsalvageable. But crucially, the presence of one or more of those elements doesn't mean a killing is inevitable. Most people who feel shame, who have financial problems, who are in affairs, do not kill. The psychology we try to map is about motive, pathways, and warning signs, not deterministic prediction.
That distinction between risk factors and inevitability feels central to what we want to explore. Let's go back in time. The public faced a family who, on social media, looked happy. Shanann was very active online, posting videos, documenting the kids, promoting her Thrive business. They'd bought a big house, had 2 kids, and were expecting a third. But behind the posts, the couple had filed for bankruptcy in 2015, and by 2018 there were financial stresses and what friends later described as emotional distance between Chris and Shanann. An affair with a coworker, Nicole Kessinger, began in June 2018. Lena, how did these kinds of stressors typically factor into the broader picture?
They matter, but context is everything. Financial strain, feelings of inadequacy, and new sexual relationships can all be precipitating stressors. They can catalyze a plan in someone who already has tendencies toward controlling, dishonest, or manipulative behavior. But those stressors alone usually don't cause violence. We look for the interplay between personality traits, like narcissistic entitlement or antisocial features, and acute triggers. In Watts's case, the affair and the idea of a new life with someone else might have created an opportunity in his mind, if he was already prone to seeing relationships as transactional or ownership-based.
Transactional. That word keeps coming up in reporting and in court documents. He reportedly told Nickel that he was divorcing, that the marriage was over. He deleted social media, contacted real estate agents, and searched things online about living arrangements. Those actions suggest planning, not just an impulse. But then his initial explanation to police changed. First, he told them a version where Shanann killed the children and he strangled her in a rage. Later, after failing a polygraph, he confessed to killing Shanann and then the children. That deception, what does that tell us, Lena?
Deception tells us several things. 1, there's an attempt to control the narrative. 2, it can be a self-protective strategy, shift blame, reduce personal culpability. And 3, it may show a level of cognitive compartmentalization, where the offender can craft different stories to different audiences. Psychologically, it's consistent with manipulative traits, but again, it's not the same as offering a full motive. A confession, combined with shifting fabrications, suggests someone who knows the moral gravity of their acts and is attempting to deflect responsibility.
Let's trace the last weekend. Shanann traveled to Arizona for a Thrive event on August 10 through 12. She returned early morning on August 13th. Around that time, Chris later told investigators he had a serious conversation with her about the marriage, then strangled her. He wrapped her body, loaded it into his truck, put Bella and Cece, still alive, into the back seat and drove them to the oil site. There, he smothered each child and hid the bodies. Listening to that, it's almost impossible not to feel sick. I want to ask, is there anything in the clinical literature that explains why someone would transport live children like that to commit murder away from home?
It's deeply disturbing, yes. From a clinical perspective, transporting the children to a remote site could serve several functions for the offender. It could be about minimizing witnesses, creating distance from the home environment tied to the offender's image, or maintaining an illusion of normalcy while attempting to resolve a perceived problem. For some offenders, killing in a remote location is about control, controlling the environment, the timing, the privacy. It's also consistent with premeditation. You're moving bodies, you're choosing a site related to your work where you have knowledge and access.
Premeditation is something prosecutors emphasized. There was evidence like unusual activity with the truck on security footage and search histories. And yet, in the early media appearances, those televised pleas, Chris presented as a grieving husband. People parsed his body language and choice of words, often with a rush to judgment. We'll talk in a bit about media response, but first I want to go into the investigative arc. On August 15th, he took a polygraph and failed. Investigators confronted him with the failed test, and his father was brought in. And after that, he provided a partial confession that shifted over subsequent interrogations until he provided a full narrative that matched evidence at the scene. Lena, how important was the polygraph and that confrontation from an investigative standpoint?
It was pivotal. Polygraphs aren't infallible, but they can generate anxiety that makes deception harder to sustain. The use of family members in interviews, bringing in his father, was a tactical move to increase emotional pressure. Many false narratives collapse under sustained, strategic questioning and presentation of contradictory evidence. That said, the polygraph also speaks to the offender's overconfidence. He believed he could beat it, which can reflect narcissistic features, thinking rules don't apply to him. The unraveling is as much about investigative technique as it is about the psychological makeup of the suspect.
Right. Investigators found Shanann's body in a shallow grave and Bella and Cece in separate storage tanks at the Anadarko site August 16-17. The unborn baby's remains were discovered during the autopsy. By August 21, the Weld County DA filed 9 felony counts. Chris later pleaded guilty on November 6 to avoid the death penalty, and was sentenced November 19 to multiple life terms plus many additional years. The trial process is, on its face, final, but the question of motive, why, remains open to interpretation. Lena, in your view, what are the competing motive explanations that have traction in academic and public discussions?
There are several overlapping explanations. One is the affair and escape motive. He sought a new life without the obligations of his marriage, children, and another child on the way. This is supported by his actions: deleting profiles, talking to Nickel about moving in, looking into selling the house. Another is personality pathology, narcissistic entitlement, or antisocial traits, where the individual sees others as objects to be disposed of when inconvenient. There's also the self-righteous typology, where the offender blames the partner for the ruin of his life. Each of these can be true simultaneously. Importantly, none of them fully explain the moral leap to killing your own children.
That's the hard part. We can map motives, but we can't translate that into moral understanding that makes the act comprehensible. He has said things like, "It was like something implanted in my mind," and "I had no control," phrases that sound like attempts to escape responsibility. How do experts treat those kinds of statements?
With skepticism, such phrases are vague and rhetorically aimed at mitigation. They're not a clinical explanation. In forensic evaluations, someone claiming an irresistible impulse must demonstrate a diagnosable mental state impairing volition, which is a high bar. In the absence of psychosis or severe cognitive impairment, statements like "I had no control" tend to be interpreted as self-serving rationalizations.
Let's pause for a moment. I want listeners to remember the names of the victims: Shanann Watts, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Say their names with me. Good. Thank you. Lena, the case also raises questions about what friends and family could have seen. Shanann posted on social media about feeling distance from Chris. She texted friends that he wasn't excited about Nico, that he was pulling away. In hindsight, these look like red flags. In real time, though, how obvious are such signs to outsiders?
Hindsight bias is powerful. When we know an outcome, we overweigh the significance of prior signals. In real time, many relationships oscillate. People withdraw, get busy, have affairs without catastrophic escalation. The indicators that predict extreme violence are usually a pattern of coercive control, past threats, escalation of aggression, and access to means. Shanann's messages, feeling that Chris was distant, are significant emotionally, but on their own may not have stood out as precursors to homicide. That's a heartbreaking and important distinction. Not all distress foretells murder.
That's an important clarification, and it cut against some of the public commentary that blamed friends or Shanann herself, which brings us, inevitably, to the role of social media and what you've called image curation. Shanann's accounts are full of maternal joy and hustle culture for MLM. Later, documentaries used that footage to tell the story. How do we ethically use a victim's curated life in storytelling?
With the utmost care. Shanann's videos are her voice, her representation of herself as a mother and entrepreneur. Using that material can honor her actual lived presence, but it can also be exploited if the intent is spectacle. Ethical use centers her humanity and underscores her grief and rights, avoids gratuitous repetition of traumatic content, and respects family wishes. Documentarians must ask, are we illuminating the person, or are we commodifying the murder?
Some members of the public are uncomfortable with a flood of true crime content about this case, and Shanann's family has expressed discomfort at conspiracies and victim blaming. At the same time, series like Netflix's American Murder use Shanann's social posts to powerful effect, forcing viewers to feel the normalcy before the violence. Is there a line where public interest becomes exploitation? Lena?
Yes, there is a line, and it's not always obvious. Re-exposure of raw details, continuous redigging of graphic aspects, and sensationalized dramatizations often cross into exploitation. Conversely, responsible journalism and documentary can illuminate systemic problems, like how domestic violence is missed, how law enforcement responds, or how the digital footprint informs investigations. The ethical test I use is, does this work serve the victims' voices and contribute to understanding, prevention, or public safety? Or does it primarily serve entertainment and the profile of the offender?
We should talk about Nicole Kessinger for a minute, because public curiosity has been relentless. She was a coworker who began a relationship with Chris in June 2018. She cooperated with investigators and, according to reporting, had no knowledge Shanann was pregnant. Yet online sleuths, listeners, viewers, pursue and sometimes harass her years later. Is there ever a public interest justification for continuing to hunt someone who cooperated and who was not charged?
Not typically. There's a line between legitimate investigation, what was their role, what did they know, and harassment. If law enforcement has not charged her and she has cooperated, further public pursuit often becomes vindictive curiosity. That can have serious consequences for someone who is not legally implicated. Ethically, we should avoid doxing and shaming. If new evidence were to arise, law enforcement, not vigilantes, should handle it.
Let's move to clinical typologies. In the literature, family annihilators are sometimes classified as self-righteous, anomic, disappointed, or paranoid. Chris seems to contain elements of self-righteous and anomic blaming, Shanann in early lies, seeming to want a clean slate. Walk me through those categories and how they might apply here.
Sure. The self-righteous offender places culpability on the partner. She ruined us. She took everything. And the murders are framed as punishment. The anomic type equates family with status. Economic collapse triggers a belief the family is worthless. Disappointed types have an idealized image of family and punish when reality fails that ideal. Paranoid types kill because they imagined threats. In Watts's case, his attempt to shift blame, his deletion of online identity, and planning for a new life with Nicole align with self-righteous and anomic features. But remember, typologies help pattern behavior. They don't create moral explanations.
You said earlier that most people with similar stressors don't kill. So what differentiates someone who snaps versus someone who seeks divorce? Are there warning signs, behavioral, verbal, that are reliably linked to later lethal violence?
There are risk markers: prior acts of violence, obsessive control, escalation of threats, access to weapons, separation attempts that spur threats, stalking, and intense jealousy. In intimate partner homicide, a separation attempt is often a high-risk period, but the absence of those markers doesn't guarantee safety. The field lacks perfect predictors. That's why prevention requires a multi-layered approach: public awareness, screening in healthcare, training for law enforcement, and support for victims when they disclose coercion.
That connection between separation and risk is chilling in many cases. In this one, Shanann and Chris had discussed separation, and by August, they were evidently considering selling the house. She had confided fears to friends. The question I keep coming back to: could any intervention realistically have changed the course? Or are we, as a society, assigning ourselves too much psychic responsibility after the fact?
It's both. We shouldn't burden friends and families with impossible clairvoyance. But we also should cultivate environments where disclosures of control and fear are taken seriously and acted upon. That means manageable steps, asking direct questions, offering resources, helping with safety planning. In some cases, timely intervention can interrupt escalation, but it's not a guarantee. So guilt and blame directed at victims or their friends is misguided, even though our yearning for what-if answers makes that blame feel emotionally satisfying.
We should talk about the media performance, Chris's TV interviews after the disappearance. Body language analysts and armchair detectives have dissected those appearances. Detectives said they were suspicious almost immediately. From a psychological vantage, how do you reconcile a seemingly calm on-camera performance with later confession to gruesome crimes?
That performative calm can be explained by several things: emotional numbing, calculated deception, dissociation, or simple stress response variability. Many offenders can present as composed under pressure because they are used to managing impressions. Narcissistic individuals, in particular, can modulate affect to manipulate. The human brain can also compartmentalize trauma. Someone can appear unshaken outwardly while experiencing internal turmoil. It's dangerous to rely on instinctual judgments of grief performance, but in investigations, inconsistent affect, combined with other evidence, can raise flags.
You mentioned dissociation. Some people suggested Chris snapped, but the forensic evidence suggested planning, loading the truck, taking them to a remote site. Which is likelier here, an acute, uncontrollable rage, or a planned effort to eliminate obstacles to a new life?
The evidence points more toward planning. Transporting bodies, utilizing a workplace site, and concealing the remains imply forethought. The snap narrative is attractive to offenders because it casts the act as a lapse rather than a choice. Courts generally view premeditation as more consistent with moral culpability. In clinical terms, a genuine loss of control severe enough to make killing involuntary is rare and typically accompanied by identifiable severe mental disorder, none of which was credibly documented in Watts's case.
Let me bring the conversation back to the people who bear the brunt, the Ruzek family, Shanann's parents and siblings. At sentencing, her father called Chris an evil monster and spoke about trust. The family later made choices about whether the DA would seek the death penalty. They chose not to. That decision, accepting a plea in exchange for avoiding a lengthy trial and a death penalty pursuit, seems to be about finality and sparing more trauma. From a psychological and restorative perspective, what factors influence families' decisions like that?
Families weigh many things: desire for accountability, avoidance of re-traumatization through trial testimony, religious beliefs. Shanann's family, for instance, emphasized faith and forgiveness, and practical considerations like the time, cost, and uncertainty of appeal processes. For some families, a public trial is cathartic. For others, it is a renewed wound. Deciding not to pursue the death penalty is often about controlling further harm to the children and keeping the focus on remembrance and healing.
We've covered motive debates, typologies, and investigative steps. I want to pause and create a quieter moment. Lena, tell me a story, briefly, about a family annihilator case you studied where something concrete prevented further tragedy, something listeners could take away as practical rather than theoretical.
There's a case I consulted on where a woman confided to a nurse that her partner monitored her movements and had threatened to take the kids away. The nurse had mandated reporting training, so she connected the woman to a domestic violence advocate, and the advocate worked with local police to set up a safety plan and temporary relocation with packed essentials. Within 3 weeks, the woman had a restraining order and was in a transitional shelter. The partner escalated threats, but did not find them because their location was secured.
The intervention didn't fix the relationship, but it likely prevented a dangerous escalation. The concrete takeaway: trained professionals asking the right questions and connecting victims to resources can and does save lives.
That's precisely the kind of practical thread I want to pull: how systems can work. Now, to pivot, the case continues to fascinate the public. Netflix's documentary reintroduced the story to millions by using Shanann's own videos and texts as a through line. That documentary was powerful, but also stirred debate about whether retelling can re-traumatize. As producers of true crime content, how should we handle archival footage from victims? What ethical guardrails would you recommend, Lena?
Use it with clear purpose. First, obtain consent when possible from next of kin. If not possible, weigh the victim's dignity. Second, contextualize the footage. Don't let it be spectacle. Third, avoid repeated graphic replays of trauma. Fourth, provide trigger warnings and resources for listeners. And finally, consult with survivors and experts to ensure that portrayals are responsible. Ethical storytelling is not just about accuracy, it's about harm minimization.
We're doing that trigger warnings at the top, centering victims. Before we get to closing reflections, I want to ask you about a question that's been floating around the public discourse. Why, in cases like this, does the killer continue to get attention? He writes letters from prison, he receives messages and sometimes romantic overtures from strangers. What's going on psychologically and socially when people are drawn to notorious offenders?
There are several overlapping reasons. Some people are morbidly curious. Horror fascinates. Others are driven by a desire to understand evil. There's also a phenomenon called hybristophilia, sexual attraction to criminals, which explains some of the more disturbing correspondence offenders receive. Social media amplifies notoriety, and in the absence of private space, offenders become public figures. Psychologically, attention can feed narcissistic ego needs and may give offenders a secondary reward. Socially, our culture often voyeuristically elevates perpetrators, which is why ethical coverage should prioritize victims and contexts rather than turning a criminal into a celebrity.
That voyeurism has costs. It can re-traumatize families and incentivize media to dramatize gruesome details. Okay, let's return to unanswered questions. I want to read a few and invite your response. First, can such evil ever be fully explained, or are we imposing rational structure where there is none?
We can explain mechanisms, traits, stressors, situational factors, but we may never capture the subjective moral calculus that led someone to choose murder. Explanation is not the same as justification. We can map contributing factors, but some human actions lapse into moral incomprehensibility. We must tolerate the discomfort of not having tidy answers.
Second, is there any reliable way to predict a family annihilator before they act?
No reliable, foolproof way. There are risk markers and high-risk windows, like separation, and early violent behaviors will often flag danger. The goal is not prediction in the psychic sense, but prevention through multi-agency response to credible threats.
Third, do we give too much attention to the killer and not enough to the victims?
Often, yes. Media and public discourse can privilege the narrative of the offender. Ethically, the emphasis should be on victims, who they were, their relationships, the impact on surviving family, and systemic lessons to prevent future harm.
Fourth, and finally, why do we keep returning to cases like this? Is it fear, fascination, moral outrage, or a search for reassurance that we could never be like that?
All of the above. Stories of domestic betrayal cut deep because they challenge trust in intimate spaces. People consume to make sense of vulnerability. They also consume because narrative helps us rehearse moral responses. That consumption can be healthy if it leads to empathy and systems change. It becomes harmful when it veers into exploitation.
Let's end with some concrete takeaways for listeners who may be grappling with the emotional weight of this episode and perhaps know someone in a controlling relationship. Lena?
If you're worried about someone, listen without judgment. Validate their experience. I believe you. And encourage them to make a safety plan. Connect them with local domestic violence services, hotlines, shelters, legal aid. If there is imminent danger, involve law enforcement. For professionals, take disclosures seriously and have resources ready. And for all listeners, be mindful about how you discuss victims. Avoid casual speculation that shifts blame.
For those looking for resources, we'll list support organizations and hotlines in the episode notes. I want to close by returning to the people lost in this case. Shanann was a mother who made videos of her kids singing. Bella and Cece were young girls with futures stolen. Miko never took a breath. When we tell these stories, we are custodians of their memory. My last question for you, Lena. What, in your experience, helps families begin to rebuild after this kind of loss?
Rituals of remembrance, social support, and therapeutic grief work help. Public acknowledgement that their loved ones were cherished, not a footnote in someone else's infamy, matters. Families find meaning in advocacy, in turning private grief into efforts that protect others. It doesn't erase pain, but it can transform the narrative from spectacle to service.
Thank you, Lena. Before we end, I want to read a short excerpt from a statement Shanann's father gave at sentencing. Brief, but it's important context. He said, "I trusted you to take care of them, not kill them." Those words, trust, betrayed, linger. They're at the center of why we keep coming back to this case. They remind us that beyond motive debates and psychological profiles, real people were harmed.
And that trust is the core violation in family annihilation. The betrayal creates trauma that radiates beyond the immediate family, to friends, communities, and even to viewers who empathize. We owe them our care in how we remember.
If you found this episode difficult, and you probably did, that's understandable. This material is heavy on purpose. If you need to step away or seek support, please do. We'll include helplines and resources in the show notes. Thank you, Lena, for guiding us through an analytical but humane look at this case. Any final thought before we sign off?
Remember the victims. Keep asking hard questions about prevention and media ethics. And when discussing such cases, prioritize compassion over curiosity.
One last pause. A moment of silence for Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and Nico. Thank you for listening to Still Unanswered. If you appreciate this careful approach, please consider supporting the show, sharing it responsibly, and joining the conversation in our community guidelines, where we ask listeners to avoid doxing, speculation, or harassment of people not charged in crimes. Next week, we'll be exploring early warning signs in intimate partner violence and speaking to an advocate about what a safety plan can look like. Until then, I'm Morgan Ellery. Be gentle with yourselves.
Thank you, Morgan. Goodbye, everyone.